European Americans have been miseducated just as much, if not more, than we have.
Leslie Badue became president of the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP in March.
When this whole thing around equity is not exhibited and enforced.
And storyteller, playwright, and sweet potato comfort pie ambassador Rose McGee returns to Democratic Visions, this time as guest host. Here's Rose.
Welcome to Democratic Visions. I'm excited today. My guest is the lovely and talented Miss Leslie Redmond Badue. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much for having me, Miss Rose McGee.
I love it when she calls me Miss Rose. There was a time when it sounded old, but today it's an honor. It really is.
Yes, definitely.
Well, young lady, you have been so busy, and you're such an inspiration to me because you are exhibiting what I consider to be leadership, and in a courageous way. When I look at you and I hear that you are the youngest president in the country of NAACP branch?
Yes, so I'm definitely the youngest. I became president at the age of 25 for the Minneapolis chapter. So I'm sure that I'm the youngest in Minneapolis. I'm one of the youngest probably ever in the history of the NAACP.
This is the month of June, and in June we tend to celebrate something called Juneteenth. And I didn't even know what Juneteenth was until I was well into adulthood. So the idea of this particular celebration and its meaning has been one that stuck with me for a while. I have this wonderful book, which is a play, Kumbaya, the Juneteenth story, that was written over 20 years ago. So we know that it was on or around the 19th of June when people who look like us got word of their freedom.
Right.
So what does that mean today? How does that play out today? I mean, are we free?
We're definitely not free, unfortunately. I think we have the illusion of inclusion and freedom going on. However, I think we are very much so still in bondage, right? Even the idea that someone else can free you, right, is an illusion that I think we like because it helps us to go day to day. However, we are very much so still enslaved. So Juneteenth has a significant meaning to me because all of my family is from the South. So we migrated to Washington, D.C. during the Great Migration. But my grandparents were from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Houston, Texas. And so they really fled the South in order for a better future and trying to give my parents and then myself, right, their descendants. And so that's really an honor. But to think about the fact that we still had sharecropping going on, we still had people living on plantations, and I think they were just left behind almost. And then a lot of us that fled to the North, we fled to just another form of slavery, right? And so it wasn't as direct, but it was very institutionalized, right? And that's why we have mass incarceration going on. That's why we have the school to prison pipeline. I like to call our public education system 12 years of slavery because literally we're just enslaving and indoctrinating the minds of Black children to think that they're not human, right? They're second-class citizens. You don't see them in their textbooks. You see us in very shady and savage ways, right? When you think about how we're portrayed on the TV screens, which is why it's such an honor to be up here with you today to be able to counter that narrative because we know we've always had freed, quote-unquote, Black people in America, but the masses have always been enslaved, and they continue to be enslaved until this day.
Right. And that's why organizations such as NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and some people will say, well, why are we using the word colored in this day and age? But that's a whole nother story. But it encompasses every aspect of diversity in that sense. And then there's the understanding of, well, what is diversity? There's the comfort level and the discomfort level of what diversity is. I've gone to things where it's been labeled as, oh yeah, this is going to be an evening of diversity. And I get there and it's diversity means other nations such as people who are maybe from France or from Greece or things like that. It doesn't have to do with where we come from in terms of people who were enslaved in this country. And that's the piece of what we're missing. We're missing, and you're right.
100%.
In terms of books, in terms of educational materials that are serving as resources for teachers to really help show to students to learn things about their history that can give them some good, strong pride and self-identity in who they are is terribly missing. 100%. And you would think that in 2018, things would be different. And that isn't to say that we haven't come a long way, because we have. We have come a long way. But there are those who really do work hard intentionally to keep us going backwards. They, so that's a whole nother story.
And I would just add on, I think we, the elite or the chosen Black few, have come a long way. But the masses, I think we've just gone miles and miles backwards. And I think that's felt every day. And unfortunately, those people just don't have a voice. And I like to say they do have a voice, but their voices are constantly being hindered and overshadowed. And so when I was younger, I used to say, I want to be the voice of the voiceless. But now I say, I just want to create a platform for people who have a voice to be heard, because they're not being heard. And I think we're seeing that with elections, and we're just seeing that all over, that the masses are tired of being silenced. And with this wave of social media coming on, they will not be silenced. And so I think that it's going to be wise for us to listen to them and make sure that they're heard.
And that's why I really appreciate your courageousness. And I don't say that lightly, because the word courageous gets overemphasized to where it gets watered down after a while. But people respond out of being sick and tired of being sick and tired, as Fannie Lou Hamer said. So when that happens, change does occur, but it takes a certain spirit of an individual to step up to that. So I appreciate you doing that. I admire that in you. And so when I was president of NAACP years ago in Rochester, Minnesota, and used to attend the national conventions, there were always people who were older, that were running things, obviously, but there definitely was going on the sidelines somewhere, those who were trying to get young people involved. So what is it that's happening that's making young people say, all right, I want to be a part of this organization that's been known to be run by older people? Because clearly there was a time when it was becoming somewhat complacent in the minds of people, and not everywhere. And I have to be clear with that, because I know there are NAACP branches in places in this country that were not complacent. However, the perception was that it had become. So what's happening that's giving it this whole resurgence of energy?
Right, definitely. Well, I think it's layers, right? It's an onion, and there's so many different layers to it. I think that the majority of NAACP chapters are still ran by majority older African Americans, right? However, I also know that there are other chapters where people are really breeding their kids to join at a very young age. You'll see that's how people get involved in politics at a young age. In certain corners of the America, NAACP is still a legacy organization that young people want to be a part of because their parents are a part of, and it's very elite. However, that's also created a divide where a lot of people cannot penetrate that very elite and legacy kind of organization, right? So for me, how I got involved in NAACP was because Nikema Levy-Pounds was my law professor at St. Thomas at the time. And I just saw that it was like she was taking the keys back from something that was so historic. I think we all hold NAACP in a high regard, but a lot of young people just never receive the invitation. And it's kind of like a party that you're not invited to, so you never even try to bombard it. On the other end, I also see it where a lot of people want to hold NAACP for their own. And so it's very important for us to reach out to young people and invite them, because when I went to nationals, I didn't really see young people at all. And the ones I saw were all in the youth and college chapters. They weren't in leadership positions, which I think is so pivotal and important for us right now as we're moving forward. So I'm really excited about it, but I also recognize that I'm somewhat of an exception, not the rule. And I think we need to shift that. I see a lot of people talking about it, but it's similar to almost the elections when we talk about, getting all the Black people involved. But we're not asking the right questions of why they aren't involved. involved, and the fact that you actually need them in the room making decisions. And then when I go to a lot of schools, so I went to North High School and Lucy Laney Middle School, who have amazing Black women as principals there. And I was talking to the students, asking, first, do you know what the NAACP stands for? And almost none of the students knew.
Sure.
And that's a real reality. So when you broke it down and say the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that's important because I think people hear the acronyms a lot. Yeah. We don't know the meaning behind it. And the history is not being told. I don't blame the young people. I blame the institutions that continue to perpetuate false history and not the reality. Like, American history includes the NAACP.
That's true.
Right?
It does. And there was a reason for it having to come into being.
Right.
And so bringing all of that forth is really critical. Yeah. And you're right, if you don't get the teaching from someplace. So I have to acknowledge, you mentioned Nikema Levy-Pounds, and for her to be in the role that she was in at a major institution of higher education, and to be able to bring that energy of realness, I applaud her for that, and those who do the same thing. It's out there. That energy is out there, but we just don't get access to it the way we should. We go into schools, we don't see as many teachers who look like us. And okay, so they don't look like us. How are they teaching? So then it becomes our responsibility to help teach them. I do think that it becomes our responsibility to help teach them. Right. I've heard people say, oh no, we're not supposed to teach white people how to act. But if we don't, then who will?
Exactly.
Because then it becomes somebody else always telling our story. And not just the African American story, but I think of indigenous people of this country in particular. Right. And I think of that larger wave of people who've been brought here, fleeing their own countries for safety, so many people. Right. And when this whole thing around equity is not exhibited and enforced in a way that works for everyone, it does impact everyone. 100%. So injustice for, one is injustice for all.
Exactly.
And that's something that we have to keep in mind as well.
And I love what you said about that, because I like to think about it. We're all relatives. Some of us are distant relatives and maybe we've got away from the core, but we're all related, right? It's about the human race.
Well, we were all created in Africa, right?
Literally, exactly. Literally.
We were.
Literally, we all.
And everyone isn't quite ready to deal with that either, and that's a tough one, but it's true, and there is proof of that, so the intellectuals know that.
Exactly.
But then when you talk about learning and resources, the number of people who for centuries worked really hard to make sure that didn't become a narrative. Right. And it still is there. I mean, remember the map? You're probably too young, but I jumped to that map.
I know what you're talking about.
That was out there. I grew up with this map of looking at the United States and looking at Europe as being this big thing, and here Africa was this little tiny thing, like a little Cohen, and that was totally not the truth. So
exactly.
Bringing the truth forward is a remarkable way of teaching that we have to do more of, and have more people who are courageous enough to step up to the plate and do it.
And like you said, we need European Americans doing it and African Americans. It has to be us doing it together. And I mentioned those two schools, North High School and Lucy Laney, but I've seen European American teachers doing an amazing job of bringing people like myself in and making sure that voices are heard. And when I went to Lucy Laney and the principal was taking us around, there was one European American teacher in particular, and he did know what the NAACP stood for. And he took the students through a very intentional course of helping them to find the answers for themselves. And I thought it was just so great. And you see some European American teachers will have a lot of Afrocentric, you'll have the Malcolm X's and the Sojourner Truths around the classroom, so the students can see themselves in what they're doing. And whereas we definitely need Black teachers 100%, I don't think that there's anything that can substitute that. We also need to recognize that what we're dealing with right now, and the fact that there are a lot of European Americans in the school, and how do we assist them, but also have institutions being ready to bring people like you in and myself in, and also compensate them, right? Again, I believe we are still slaves, and we need to stop doing free labor, and we do need to be compensated for our expertise.
Yes.
And I think Black people, we're so loving. We always want to just give it away for free.
Yeah.
And again, that's another form of slavery. And so I always urge people, no, be compensated for your work because you have value.
It's true. That's very true. This whole conversation around reparations is one that people like to, back off on. And it's something that really should be. And understanding what reparation means, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going out and writing a check to everybody, but it does mean that there's certain things that can be done that can help them having a greater ability to play with equity on the field.
100%.
And education is one of them. And if people choose to have access to starting their own business, that's another one of them. And if they choose to want to own their own homes, that's another one. But when you don't have the money because you haven't had the ability to acquire, and I mean, let's face it, there was a time, I'm not sure what the statistic is now, but the average white male could start a business and it could fail 11 times and they could still start a new business. Now, why is that? So these are the kinds of things that can make a difference in terms of becoming more equitable. Give people an opportunity with that chance. Now, not everyone understands that because they don't understand the history. So there are those who would go, oh no, that's just so unfair. That's what affirmative action, and affirmative action is so unfair. But if you don't understand the history, then you can't quite get it. So it's tough. It's very challenging for people.
And I think that's why teachers play such a critical role. I can remember being in an economics class and one of my colleagues asking, why is it that America is this great nation, right? And that we're able to move centuries past people when it comes to currency and just wealth overall. And the professor ended up talking about the Industrial Revolution and how intentional we were with building the railroads and giving away property by the railroads in order to really make those communities thrive.
Yeah.
And I'm always trying to pick my battles and weigh when I'm going to say something and not. And I wonder, was he going to mention African Americans? And he didn't. So I raised my hand and I said, why is it when we talk about this, we don't talk about who were building those railroads, right? Who were being deprived of having land and ownership and currency at the very same time that we were giving it away.
Right.
And so we have to acknowledge generational poverty, but also generational wealth that was privileged and that was unwarranted and that America just decided to give away, and that it was built on the backs of Black people. And that's something that America just doesn't want to acknowledge. I think about Michelle Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama, when she talked about slaves or enslaved Africans building a White House and the outrage that it got. And I don't blame the individuals who are upset. I blame the institutions that has been miseducated. I think about Carter G. Woodson and the miseducation of the Negro. Well, European Americans have been miseducated just as much, if not more, than we have.
True.
And so if we don't teach them about our how much of an asset we are to this country and how much we've poured into it, they'll continue to look at us this way.
Right. And that's very true, which has caused many African Americans to look at themselves in a negative way and to look at each other in a negative way. And that's why education is so important, even within our own cultures. We're still having that thing, that somebody coined, the Willie Lynch syndrome, as this letter that, surfaced a few years ago. So if we have that mentality, then how can we expect others to, step up to change that we're asking for? So going back to this Juneteenth thing also, since this will be aired the month of June, I can remember when I first learned about it. Now, I'm from Tennessee, raised up in a Black community, went to a Black college, Black church, all of that, and never heard of Juneteenth until I was an adult and moved to Denver, Colorado. And the African Americans from Texas who migrated to Colorado were celebrating this thing called Juneteenth, and I'm calling it Juneteenth. What's Juneteenth? Juneteenth, Rose, Juneteenth. And the fact that they celebrate that instead of the 4th of July, because that was their official day of emancipation. So as you mentioned, when you go into schools and you ask students if they know what NAACP means and they've not heard of it, I have the same thing when I go in oftentimes and ask, do you know what Juneteenth is? Oh yeah, that's the time when you go to the park and my mama won't let me go because you get shot. And trying to help them to understand that that is not the real thing.
Right.
That's the narrative that has been, built up and perpetrated in a way that makes you now not understand a significant part of your history.
Exactly.
So these are the reasons why we have to make sure that the history is passed down. And one of our favorite historians in this state is Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati.
Yes.
Because he's got it all up there. And in the book, he actually does the foreword. And when I was writing the story, he just gave me so much information that made me then have to go back and research
Right.
and understand Frederick Douglass a little deeper.
Right.
And so this whole thing about if there is no struggle, there's no progress, that really is why NAACP is so needed today, because as is one of the slogans, the struggle continues.
Yes.
So, and I'm excited that the Marvel people or whoever had the foresight to bring the movie Black Panther, the manner in which they did, because it was done beautifully. And what it's done is given people, it's uplifted them.
Right.
And it's uplifted them in a way that makes them see the possibilities.
100%. And one thing I just hope doesn't get lost is the real history, right? So how we talk about the real Black Panthers that
Yes.
really exist, right? And that real
Yes.
history that isn't taught, or if it's taught, it's being miseducated, right? And people are only looking at it one side and not talking about the liberation and the free breakfast program and the literacy programs and the free clinics that the Black Panthers brought to the United States, right? We don't talk about that.
Key.
And so when you talk about reparations, for me, it's about FUBU, for us, by us, and the fact that we need to have our own institutions, because one of the things that really set us back that we don't talk about is when we integrated the schools, or we had a fake version of integration, right? Brown versus Board of Education, I think, was very effective on social context, right? For us to be able to sit at the same counters. But like MLK said, if we don't have the money to buy a burger, what is it to be good to sit beside someone at a counter, right?
Yeah.
And so we think about the education system and how we had a widespread firing of Black teachers and took them out of these schools and integrated European American teachers into the school. And there was no reparations for that, right? We were never able to actually rectify the situation where Black students were learning tremendously. Some of our best intellects that have ever walked the face of this earth came from being taught by Black people, right? It's not post-integration. In actuality, I think post-integration has hindered us. And that's why we have this large divide where even we have these Black intellects, right, who talk about the theory but don't understand the reality and context and aren't uplifting the voices of the masses. And so I think history is critical. And there's a documentary that we watched actually at law school, and it was called With All Deliberate Speed, right? And they talk about the phrase that they use when Brown versus Board of Education was given. And it said, just integrate with all deliberate speed, which was the cue that the South needed to delay their integration. And when they did it in a very intentional way to still make Black people second-class citizens. And then that's when you have the white flight and people leaving the communities, and now you have gentrification where now they want their communities back, quote unquote. And so that history, why is that not being taught in history classes? Why is that not being taught in social studies? And for me, that's where reparations can play a key role, where we can have institutions for us, by us.
Yes. And deliberate is an interesting word, because one of the words that I have in the play was a quote that came out of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. There will be gradual emancipation. So everything that has to do with people of color in this world of enslavement, it's at somebody else's pace.
Exactly.
And now here we are, understanding that there's an urgency that's needed, that needs to be done in a way that helps to rectify some of this gradual stuff that's been inflicted all along because of deliberate decisions that those in power have made. So we really have our work cut out for us.
100%.
And I'm so thankful that you are part of this leadership in it.
Thank you.
And one thing I want to also acknowledge, because we have seen historically people like Thurgood Marshall and Dr. King and others who had the intellect, who have the formal training, and yet somewhere in there, there became this perception, as you kind of mentioned earlier, that if people were educated formally, then some of us get a little off about the fact that, oh, well, they're a little uppity or they're whatever. Mm-hmm. But it takes all of us. And I want to thank you because you're a law student and you're getting ready to become that formally trained legal mind. And that's good because, as Keith Ellison made, and I heard him make this plea to the black lawyers. What is it? Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers.
Yes.
There's that acronym, MABLE, right?
Yes, yes.
I'd love to spell out the
Yes,
acronym
that's
so that
important.
people understand what it is. That their role really is to become involved, because there's so much now that can be used against people from a legal perspective. And if someone doesn't understand what the law means, then we continue to lose our properties or lose our grounds or lose our whatever. So anything you want to say about that?
Well, Zora Neale Hurston said if you are silent about your oppression, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And one of the things I noticed was when I got to law school, not just the black students, but even the white students, the circumstances and the environments that you're put in, it's not one that really prompts you to really go out and get involved, especially for a first generation, or if this is something that's been in your family for a long time, which is what I've noticed. So when you think about the legal field, 12% people of color in it, which doesn't leave that much room, right? So I was the only African-American student in all of my first year law classes. And even the ones that I met, they were so deep in the struggle, right, for progress, they didn't really see how they could fit into the community or where it was. I will say I've seen a lot of improvement since I've arrived to Minnesota. Okay. But one of the reasons why I think there's a disconnect, you brought up Thurgood Marshall. So his teacher, Charles Hamilton Houston, was actually from Washington, D.C., where I'm from. He went to Dunbar High School, which is the high school that my mother and my aunt attended, the first black public school in America. And he saw the importance of coming back to his community, right? Mm-hmm. If he didn't go back and become the dean of Howard University, we might not have a Thurgood Marshall, right? Mm-hmm. But one, I didn't learn that history. So there wasn't, I think that there's an intentional institutionalized racism and white supremacy that doesn't want us to know our greatness, doesn't want us to know that we are all interconnected. I think this idea of individualism has struck in too many black people, and that's something that we have to really move away from. And it's something that I really see you do that is really great. So I want to really make sure I acknowledge you. Definitely that one, you encourage us to focus on love and not hate. And I remember when we met at the Mabel Gala and I was receiving the award in the name of your late husband, William B. McGee. And I remember I didn't even know that much about him, but we must have kindred spirits. And his spirit was like, Leslie, she's the one that should receive it. Mm-hmm. And it was so great meeting you that day, but then also running into you again at the 4th Precinct during the 18-day occupation. And you really lended an opportunity for youth voice to be heard. When you were giving the sweet potato comfort pies to the police officers, I was like, oh my goodness, after that tragic night that happened. And it had really kind of tainted my faith in humanity. And it was like your love and your light that kind of helped pull me back. And I really appreciated that. But also that when you were getting interviewed, you say, there's another voice that needs to be at this table. And I think that's the distinction between what a lot of people don't do. I think we fought so hard for acknowledgement and to be heard that when we get heard, we don't allow for other voices to be heard. And that's something that you've done tremendously, and I appreciate. And I think that gives room for young people like myself to have a seat at this table. And so what I would urge other black people who have quote unquote made it in America is to lend your advancement or your privilege to help the other generation or the next generation that's coming along, right? I am because we are.
Thank you, Ms. Leslie Redmond Badue, for being a part of this and keeping us on point and keeping me on point. I love it. I appreciate it as well.
Thank you.
I'm Rose McGee, and it's been a pleasure hosting Democratic Visions. Thank you.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers from Eden Prairie, Hopkins, Edina, Minnetonka, and Bloomington. Watch us on select cable systems and on our YouTube channel. This is Carol Sundstrom.